Hello, my name is Lily Padavina, and today I will be discussing the second wave of the women's movement. The word feminism arose in 1837 when a French philosopher began writing about women's social status, and ever since it has been directly correlated to women-led or activism for equality. A feminist is defined as someone who believes in the social, political, and economic equality of the sexes. Therefore, a feminist can be anyone regardless of their gender or age. Over time, the feminist movements were broken into waves. The first wave of feminism began in the late 1800s and extended to the early 1900s. The primary focus of this wave was women earning the right to vote. The second wave of feminism began in the early 1960s and was made up of mostly white and middle-class women who were inspired due to their feelings of unfulfillment in their role as a housewife or mother, and they felt that they deserved more. This wave began because, despite being asked to fill in for men in the workplace while they were away at war, after World War II, women were pushed back out of the workplace so that men could return to their pre-war positions and women could return to the household. It is thought by many that the second wave feminism was inspired by the civil rights movement. This is because civil rights had created an environment of activism around the world that made people feel as if they could speak out against other topics which they felt were unjust. There were many key topics of this revolution, a couple of which were addressing the topics of sexism, the patriarchy, domestic violence, and marital rape, pushing reforms which push for equality in the workplace, and legalizing abortion as well as birth control, and dissipating the stigma regarding women and their sexual activity or presence. One of the first major events of second-wave feminism was regarding women and their position in the SNCC. Women had historically held significant positions within organizations such as the Student National Coordinating Committee, or the SNCC, and the Students for a Democratic Society, or the SDS. Despite these positions, women were unsatisfied by the way in which their ideas were pushed aside simply because of their gender. It soon became clear, without protest, even organizations such as these, who were enlightened in regards to racial inequality, would still continue to adhere to the patriarchy. As a result of this, in November of 1964, Casey Hayden and Mary King, two women who were members of the SNCC, wrote a letter titled "On the Position of Women in the SNCC," which served as a way for them to freely air their complaints. In this letter, they stated a number of complaints, which included: the staff was involved in crucial constitutional revisions at the Atlanta staff meeting in October. A large committee was appointed to present revisions to the staff. The committee was all men. Number two organizers were working together to form a farmers' league. Without asking any questions, the male organizer immediately assigned the clerical work to the female organizer, although both had equal experience in organizing campaigns. Number three, although there are some women in Mississippi Project who have been working as long as some of the men, the leadership group in the COFO is all men. This list continues on, and the women go on to address the fact that these complaints may seem silly to the men, however, they were extremely important to the women of this organization. In response to this, Stokely Carmichael stated that the appropriate position of women in the civil rights movement was no involvement at all. So essentially, he was telling them to be quiet and that they should be there. This list continues on, and the women go on to address the fact that these complaints may seem silly to the men, however, they were extremely important to the women of this organization. In response to this, Stokely Carmichael stated that the appropriate position of women in the civil rights movement was no involvement at all. So essentially, he was telling them to be quiet and that they should be there. with how far they had gotten in this movement despite their gender. Although it may be surprising, not every part of the civil rights movement was hindering to women. In fact, when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, it prohibited discrimination in places of work based on race, color, national origin, religion, and gender. Ironically, the inclusion of women was added on by a Virginian congressman in an attempt to stop the bill from passing. One very important person at this time was Betty Friedan. Friedan is best known for her book, The Feminine Mystique, which was published in 1963. In this book, she spoke out against the idea that a woman's destiny was to marry and have kids, which was a common idea following World War II. Friedan was also the first president of the National Organization for Women, or NOW. The NOW's goal was to make women's participation in all aspects of American life possible and to gain all the rights enjoyed by men. One of this organization's main focuses was the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment, or the ERA, which promised women equal rights. The ERA was introduced in 1923 and passed in 1972. However, it did not receive the 38 state ratifications necessary to be added to the Constitution, and it still has not today. Despite the ERA not being passed, huge leaps were made for women in 1960 when the FDA approved birth control, which gave women the right to limit, delay, or prevent pregnancy. This in turn allowed them to work, study, and delay marriage. Within 5 years of this release, nearly 6 million women were found to be using birth control. The pill is also known to have revolutionized medicine, as it was the first medicine ever to not be taken for a sickness, but rather electively. This was supported by conservatives as well, because they felt that marriages were becoming closer without the continuous fear of unwanted pregnancy. However, this pill was not supported by all. Many thought that by releasing such a pill, they were promoting the sexual promiscuity of women, the institution of both marriage and family, and destroying the nation's moral standing. By the early 1960s, 30 states had made it a criminal offense to sell any form of birth control. In addition to birth control, abortion was also becoming normalized and legal at this point, which allowed women to decide if they were ready or able to have kids. Later in the 1960s, a group known as the New York Radical Women protested gender expectations and stereotypes at the Miss America pageant in Atlantic City, New Jersey. They did so by crowning a sheep as the winner of the pageant and tossing items representative of female oppression, such as girdles, bras, high heels, and curlers, into a freedom trash can. This event is oftentimes referred to today as the bra-burning protest, which was one of the first moments in history where women publicly stood up against male oppression. Another major achievement of this time was when John Kennedy entered office, because when he came into office, he made it clear that he sided with the women by establishing the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women to keep him up to date on current women's issues. He upheld this promise once again by signing the Equal Pay Act on June 10th of 1963. This act addressed the pay gap, which in 1940 was that women were making half of a man's salary. By the 1960s, women were making 60 cents for every $1 earned by a man. Although this may seem better, it was still at nowhere the place where it needed to be. Another important figure at this time was Simone de Beauvoir. Beauvoir was known for her book, The Second Act, which famously includes, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman." This quote represents how society fosters the idea of what a woman should do and how they should act, while also speaking to the fact that gender roles are a learned behavior, which are forced upon women. In 1969, another female writer, Kate Millett, wrote Sexual Politics, which discusses how society controls sex and sexual expressions relation to politics, as well as how men are connected to discrimination based on sex, gender, race, and class. Only a year after this was published, Carol Hanisch published an essay by the name of "The Personal is Political", which argued that everything from the division of household labor to gender roles was determined and influenced by politics. As these pieces of literature continued to be released, many more women were breaking into the political atmosphere. A perfect example of this is Shirley Chisholm, which became not only the first woman, but also the first African American to win a presidential primary. In addition to the leaps being made by feminists, there were also a number of groups being formed within the feminist movement. These groups include equal rights feminism, radical feminism, and minorities. In the 60s and 70s, the equal rights feminists included mostly older white women from affluent backgrounds and sought equality with men both politically and socially, and focused on changing legislation. On the other hand, radical feminism consisted of mostly younger white women or minorities and fought against the patriarchy in hopes of changing society as a whole. In addition to this, women of color were beginning to feel underrepresented in race. A large percentage of the leaders of feminist movements were white. Minorities felt that the feminist movement should aim to incorporate racial issues in addition to those regarding feminism. The most controversial issue of this movement was recognizing lesbian and bi women as well as diversifying the women portrayed in popular culture. The final group seen within the feminist movement at this time was ecofeminists. In this movement, women discussed how they were collaborative, inclusive, peaceful, nurturing, democratic, and holistic in their approach to problem solving than men. In this example, they used the biology argument to their advantage and said that because of their biological connection to the Earth and lunar cycles, women were natural advocates of environmentalists. As an extension of this movement, women of this time became involved in global issues, which was seen through their protest, which took place in 1961 to fight against the ground testing of nuclear weapons. This event showcases ecofeminists in their natural environment. Following all of these events, the second wave of feminism came to an end in the 1990s, right as the third wave of feminism began. The third wave of feminism represented modern-day feminism and serves as a continuation of the fight for gender equality and equal rights. The main focus of this movement is the pay gap, which is currently still at approximately 20%. Other focuses include individual achievement and support for survivors of domestic violence. As well as this, greater leadership from people of color, lesbians, and transgender women is continuously being seen. Many constructs, such as the notion of universal womanhood, body, gender, sexuality, and heteronormativity, are beginning to be destabilized by this movement. Throughout this wave, women have taken back many of the things which past movements have seen as male oppression, such as lipstick, high heels, and even something as simple as low-cut shirts. They have also come to reclaim words such as slut and bitch in an attempt to deprive sexist culture of their verbal weapons. Most third wavers refuse to identify as feminists and reject the word that they find limiting and exclusionary. Feminism in this wave tends to be global, multicultural, and it shuns simple answers or artificial categories of identity, gender, and sexuality. It is important to note that as the years have gone by, feminism has grown and no longer refers just simply to women's struggles, but a struggle for gender equality as a whole. It is thought by many that third wave feminism is beginning to transition to a fourth wave as more and more young women and men continue to speak out about the issues which are still present in today's society.